Today I'm going to try and talk about biological agents of interest. And when Professor Michael Reid asked me to give this talk, he said, I just want you to cover all these agents and all these things. And that's a really long talk. That's not 20 minutes. So today I'm going to really try and address some of those agents in a bit more detail, their clinical presentation, a little bit about their treatment, and what do you think you could do if you think your patient might be affected by a biological agent of interest. And really, I think I just want to highlight that biological agents of interest are not that different from other causes of infection, and it's often pretty difficult to work out that this is potentially an incidence of bioterrorism. So what is a biological agent? It involves the use of microorganisms. That can be bacteria, viruses, fungi and toxins, and they produce death or disease in humans, animals and plants, because of course you can have bioterrorism agents that are applied to animals and plants. Few healthcare workers actually are trained in the recognition and treatment of bioterrorism agents. But the things that you are trained in and you do have in your toolbox are those that you use for any other disease outbreak. That is detection, personal protection, infection control and treatment. And it is still the same principles and still the same tools. That list of agents there is on the Department of Health website, and they're the ones of particular interest. The CDC has a list of agents. They have some Category A agents, which they say that anthrax and smallpox are high on their list, and that's because they can be grown easily in large quantities, they're sturdy, they're resistant to destruction, and they're well suited to airborne dissemination, so you can affect lots of people potentially. When you think about biological agents, these are the sort of factors that you look at: how infectious it is, how severe the disease would be, the incubation period, is it short or long, how easily it spreads from person to person, how quickly it causes death, and how stable is it in the environment. Because if you wanted to produce your own agent, you'd have to think about, how do I get hold of it in the first place? If you've got it, how do you actually grow it up? How do you actually store it? And can you handle it safely yourself without becoming infected? And how easy is it to disseminate? If you think about it, 40,000 spores of anthrax is about enough to fit on the head of a pin, and that would cause a death rate of about 95% if you inhaled those spores. So potentially you can have a biological incident with minimal startup equipment and supplies, but deployment is quite difficult. A semi-microbiologist could grow some of these agents, but it's difficult to grow on a large scale and then disseminate. So I'll provide a bit more detail about some of those agents. Anthrax. Now, anthrax fits some of those features. It's very resistant to heat and cold. You can boil it and freeze it and that won't get rid of it. It's a bacteria that produces spores, and the spores are the things that are hard to get rid of. Anthrax occurs naturally in Australia. There's an anthrax belt and that extends, it's mainly in New South Wales, reaches down to Victoria, and periodically there's incidents of anthrax in usually grazing animals, but it can affect things like kangaroos as well. Essentially they inhale the spores or eat the spores and become sick. Normally that's picked up because a farmer finds a dead animal and the animal's bleeding from the nose, and that's anthrax. There was an unusual outbreak in 1997 in the Golden Valley, and there was about 200 cattle that died and a few sheep. They had to do a control program to control this, and that involved vaccinating over 80,000 cattle from more than 500 herds. The Department of Agriculture does maintain a vaccine bank just for outbreaks like this. And Australia didn't have anthrax before white settlers arrived, so they brought the anthrax to that part of the country. And when the animal dies and is left on the ground, then that's where the soil gets contaminated. So this is a picture of cutaneous anthrax. There's actually 4 different types of anthrax. There's cutaneous, gastrointestinal, inhalational and injection anthrax. In Australia there's been 3 cases of cutaneous anthrax since 2002, and all of those cases have resulted from close contact with infected animal carcasses or with machinery that in turn has been in contact with infected animal carcasses. In the 1920s and 30s, there was actually a number of cases that occurred from shaving brushes where the bristles have been contaminated with anthrax spores, and people who got that usually died because there were no antibiotics in those days. In 2010, there were several cases of anthrax in heroin addicts, and this occurred in Scotland, and the outbreak killed 14 people. It caused severe infection of the soft tissues around the injection site, and the treatment, they required extensive surgical debridement and antibiotics, of course. If you don't treat cutaneous anthrax, it can cause mortality 20% of the time. If you do treat them, then it's less than 1%. So what about inhalational anthrax? This is a more severe disease, and it's got a really long incubation period. It's cited as being from 1 to 60 days, which is long. The bigger the infecting dose to start off with, the shorter the incubation period. So it depends how many spores are ingested. Symptoms appear pretty quickly, and you can see in the early stages that will be pretty hard to differentiate from even an influenza-like illness, but the terminal phase is pretty quick, and death can occur quite quickly. This is a chest x-ray showing the classical signs on x-ray of anthrax, inhalational anthrax, with a widened mediastinum with large nodes there, and some mediastinal edema and a pleural effusion. And I think, yeah, we all know classical signs on x-rays. Classics hardly ever happen in real life, it seems to me. But if that sign was there with someone with a respiratory illness, that should ring some alarm bells. So what about using it as a bioterrorism agent? This is an example actually of sort of accidental bioterrorism. This occurred in the Russian town of Sverdlovsk. In 1979, there were 77 cases. I think 66 of them died from inhalational anthrax. 73 of the 77 lived within a 4-kilometre track from the local biological weapons manufacturing site that happened to be there. There was prevailing winds of 18 kilometres per hour, and there was an inadvertent release of the anthrax spores. At the time, the Soviet government said that this was in fact gastrointestinal anthrax and people had been eating contaminated meat, but was very suspicious given the way that they had presented. The Russian government sent experts to the US to explain how this had happened. It wasn't until the 80s where there was a more free exchange of scientific information between Russia and the rest of the world that CDC scientists actually investigated this further and obviously able to conclude it was inhalational anthrax. And indeed, I think in 1991, the Soviet government did admit, in fact, it was inhalational anthrax, and what had happened is at the biological weapons facility they'd taken a filter off, an air filter they'd dismantled for cleaning and forgot to put it back on and discharged the spores into the air and caused that many deaths. There was lots of animals that were affected as well. So it just shows you it doesn't take very much and you can have quite a deal of illness as a result. Gastrointestinal anthrax is actually really rare, and it causes some ulceration in the gut, and it's usually got a very high mortality rate as well. Whilst I say it's rare, this was a case that was written up in the literature, and it involved a woman who went to a vegan community drumming event, which the mind boggles, but apparently the community come together, they all brought their drums, and they drummed for 2 hours to feel better, I guess. And she managed to ingest a spore. And in fact, animal hides and in drums are a recognised cause of contamination with anthrax, so that the hides haven't been cured properly, the spores remain. So it just shows you it doesn't take very much to cause that infection, and it can present in some unusual ways. And of course, everybody's heard of anthrax in the US, the anthrax letters from 2001. In that situation, there were 22 cases of anthrax, 18 confirmed, 4 suspected, and it was from a deliberate contamination of some letters. Some anthrax spores were actually put in letters sent through the US mail system to various destinations, and the people who were most exposed were those who worked in the post office because they had an automatic mail sorting machine, and that mail sorting machine aerosolised, sort of sprayed the spores into the air, so they were the people most affected. They gave prophylaxis and vaccination to everyone in close proximity of the incident. They had a lot of non-specific presentations with gastrointestinal symptoms alone or some minimal respiratory symptoms. Of all the cases, they all had abnormal chest x-rays with mediastinal lymphadenopathy, pulmonary opacities or consolidation and pleural effusions. Interestingly, the clean-up costs from that event in 2012 were estimated to be over $320 million, and there's buildings that they haven't used since. So you can see this wasn't very much product, and the person who was ultimately implicated as being the cause of this was a scientist who worked for the government and had access to the anthrax spores, who committed suicide before it was ever finally investigated. So what do you do? How do you treat it? Well, there are anthrax guidelines. The Department of Health has anthrax guidelines on its website, and I suspect Jane was key to developing these. You have, of course, additional adjunctive therapies, so IV fluids, ventilation, steroids. There's 2 antitoxins. I'll have to say Raxibacumab is one of these. It's a monoclonal antibody, and an anthrax immune globulin. Both of those have shown promising effects in animals, and they've been given to well people to look for safety, but to say that they are going to make a big difference is pretty hard to know, and really difficult to do the studies to show that. Before 2001, death rate from inhalational anthrax was around 90%, but since that time, 8 of 15 people have survived, and they've survived really because of combination antibiotic treatment, and as well as that, they've had aggressive pleural effusion management. So what's another agent? Well, there's plague, and plague was used back in World War II. The Japanese didn't aerosolise the plague bacteria itself. They actually dropped infected fleas into China, and those infected fleas and then infected the local rat population, and that's how they spread the disease. So this is how it works. The rats have the plague, the fleas bite the rats, the fleas bite the people. That then causes a regional lymphadenopathy and a bubo forms. It can then cause septicemia. You can cough plague onto the next person, and once you've got pneumonic plague, you've got more people coughing, and then it's absolutely more dangerous. It's as I said, it comes as in bubonic plague, septicemic plague, or pneumonic plague. Death occurs from pneumonic plague in about 2 to 6 days, and the mortality is about 50 to 60%. And bubonic plague, mortality is about 5 to 15%. There's currently an epidemic of bubonic plague in Madagascar. I think on the 7th of October, the Madagascan Health Ministry reported that 343 people have been infected, 42 have died, and the numbers are rising rapidly. This isn't actually bioterrorism. Madagascar has outbreaks of plague from time to time. What is more alarming at this point is that this is occurring in quite densely populated parts of Madagascar, and where coughing is going to be a major method of spread, and the WHO are there on high alert. So what about smallpox? Smallpox always comes up, and I'm sure everyone in this room will know that smallpox was eradicated in 1979. I think the last naturally occurring case occurred in 1977, and in 1978 in a lab worker. So since then, smallpox has not been present in the world. It is, however, held in a couple of laboratories in the US and one in Russia, and there's always the concern that they're not the only laboratories in the world that might be holding it, and it could be a bioweapon. This is the sort of the progress of someone who's infected with smallpox. It's not until you get the rash that become infectious, and I think anyone here would go, aha, but of course It can look like chickenpox. It can look like other blistering illnesses. So, you know, the aha moment has to happen before people think of things like this. And I don't think smallpox would be high on anyone's differential diagnosis list in Australia, but you do have to think of these things to actually diagnose it. What do you do? Well, the treatment's supportive. There are some antivirals, but again, it's really difficult to do studies to know exactly how well these would work. Cidofovir mentioned there is pretty toxic, so I think there's limited options for treatment. And if you thought, and I think vaccination stopped in Australia, and I think in the late 70s, and potentially you've had a smallpox vaccination. Unfortunately, it only lasts about 10 years, so that would have worn off. You can actually use vaccination to treat people within 4 days of contact. That's because the incubation period is about 12 days, up to 12 days, and immunity from the vaccine can develop after 8 to 11 days. So potentially you could be vaccinated in time. So what are the characteristics of a biological incident that are important? Well, if you think about it, initially, that it's a biological incident will go unnoticed, except if it's a toxin, and immediately there's lots of people who are unwell. Mostly victims are not aware that they've been exposed, and it takes good detective work to work out that in fact victims all had a common geographic location where they might have been exposed, and that's from taking careful histories to understand that information. They usually will present sporadically to healthcare facilities. If you think about it, they might be exposed in one site, then go home, and if they're in a big city, they'll go home all over the city. Now, when they go to the hospital because they're becoming unwell, they don't go to the same hospital usually, they'll go to different hospitals. So again, you have to have a good surveillance system to pick up that these unusual infections are occurring in multiple sites. In the event there was a mass casualty and had lots and lots of people, you know, we're talking thousands, then that's a triage event of a mass casualty, just like any other, where resources have to be carefully allocated and managed. And that's a different circumstance from a single case or of an unusual infection. And detection equipment's not readily available. I know Jane talked about for radiological detection equipment, but this sort of equipment is pretty specialised. It's just not out there, and it's not that you're going to be able to walk around and go, aha, biological attack. You might go, aha, infection, and that's about as good as it gets most of the time. So again, the things that you have to think about and use to the best are surveillance, epidemiological methods, and importantly, having good reference laboratory diagnostic techniques. So what can we do about it? In 2007, there was a report on the regulation and control of biological agents, and that said the most effective and efficient way of minimising security risks posed by these agents is to establish a national regulatory scheme. That seems like a very government response. However, it absolutely is targeted at reducing access to these agents. It started in 2009, and laboratories who are involved in this must report that they are holding these particular SSBAs, that if they move them to another laboratory for any reason, they have to report they're being removed. They have to ensure that they've got adequate biosecurity in their laboratories, so they have to have usually additional security at their labs, and they're subject to audit and inspection to make sure they're complying. This is a really quite a powerful tool, and it just means that in Australia we know where these agents are being held, and access to them is that much harder. We also have, in terms of detection, we've got excellent microbiologists who work in our public health laboratory networks, and a number of those labs, I think about 5 of them, are part of the Laboratory Response Network, which is sponsored by the CDC. If you're a member of that network, you get access to procedures for testing a full range of agents and different specimen matrices, as well as some control reagents and some positive control material. So this is a way of improving the standard of testing and the familiarity of microbiologists with these agents so they can spot it when it comes into their lab. In Australia, we have the Australian Bioterrorism Laboratory Network, which involves many of the same laboratories plus others who also work to increase the knowledge and attention of microbiologists to these particular agents. And they're constantly looking to see if there's been any advances in the field in terms of better assays to make that a bit of an easier task. The Department of Health provides equipment and test kits to the labs, so they've got the equipment ready. Should a clinician say, I'm a bit concerned about this, they actually know what to do with that, about it. So what do you do? Remember, the most important first step to detect bioterrorism is actually to think of it and suspect it and put that in your differential diagnosis and say, could it be? You should always discuss it with your microbiologist at that point because they're the ones who will know which are the best samples to take, what tests should be done. They can help you. If it's confirmed, it will have to be reported. All these agents will be reported through the state, ultimately on nationally, and that in turn would trigger a number of plans that I spoke of yesterday, which are how we deal with these sorts of events. I haven't talked today about forensics, but if there's bioterrorism or biocrime, that's a crime scene like anywhere else, and the police will be involved. It's important for you to know that you should bag all the specimens. There's a chain of evidence that must be maintained in these sorts of cases, and I know it's a different sort of scenario for most people in clinical care, but absolutely that will be very important for working out where these agents come from and the follow-on actions within the security space. But just remember, good infection control will protect you. Think of it. Remember good infection control. Good infection control will protect you not only from these agents, but for other outbreaks of disease. So I hope I've just scared you a bit, but also made you realise how easy these sorts of things, or how well they blend from the normal disease outbreak, but they're different types of agents. Thanks.
Thank you, Jenny. Again, if there's any questions from the audience, we'd welcome those. There's plenty of time. Perhaps if you have a question, if you want to make your way up to a microphone at the front here at the back. And just while people are heading to the microphone for a question, Jenny, I have just noticed on Webjet there's some great flights from Gold Coast to Madagascar. And if the plague happened to arrive, I'm reminded of when the bird flu was there. We had these great big screening centres in the airport where people walked through and they were heat scanned, and if they were red or hot, they were screened. I wonder how many, during the bird flu pandemic, how many people were actually identified through that process, or can I be cynical and say it's probably addressing that panic notion that actually if we're seen to be doing something, people are happy and won't just turn up to the hospital. Could I ask how many people?
Yeah, look, absolutely, panic is a key feature, and I think there was I can't remember exactly when, but there was a plague outbreak somewhere in India, and millions of people left the city to avoid being in the same city, and it caused a massive civil unrest at the time. I have to tell you that thermal scanners aren't particularly useful in, particularly for influenza, because if you think about it, people can have influenza and not actually have a temperature at that point, be that clinically or because they're incubating it. I think during the pandemic, a paper from New South Wales Health showed that at Sydney Airport they scanned something like 600,000 people and ultimately found a few thousand who had temperatures, and they screened them further for the ultimate diagnosis of 3 cases of bird flu. So it just shows you it might make you feel good to look at it, but it actually is not a particularly sensitive tool.
Thank you. Was there any other questions there? Can't quite see for the lights, I'm sorry, but if there are... All right, perhaps we can catch Jenny at the end. Oh, no, there is one, please. Thank you.
Look, generally it's the usual practice. The thing is that most healthcare workers don't think of the usual practice and actually put that sort of equipment on a regular basis. And that's why my plea is to remember to think of an infectious disease, to think of personal protective equipment, because that's what will protect you, and to use it all the time that you think this is a possibility, because that will protect you from the time where the unusual possibility actually happens. So obviously, if it's a particular agent, then you might need some slightly different PPE. And if you think about Ebola and the anxiety around PPE for that, that was slightly different PPE. A respiratory illness has slightly different PPE. Yeah.
All right, we'll leave it there. Thank you, Jenny.